there are some books that I read and they're a joy to read, and afterwards I realize this book is going to be like one of my instant favorites. And this is not necessarily the same thing as being the books that end up having the biggest impact on me. Sometimes it takes a while for that to build. Nor is it the same as being my favorites. Often books that impact me, I don't like what they're telling me. And in fact, there are 4 books that I have talked about that I read this year. Conflict of Visions by Thomas Sowell, The Revolt of the Masses by Jose Ortega y Gasset, The Fatal Conceit by F.A. Hayek, and We've Never Been Woke by Musa al-Harbi, which they've been very impactful. All 3 of them have been liberating in some ways, but I also didn't like the conclusions. I still don't like the conclusions they took me to, even though I'm now grappling with them. So I wanted to talk about books sort of that I had a more positive reaction to, and I realized, so if I look back and I try to think which books have like immediately become instant favorites, I was thinking I was going to do a video on all of them, and I realized I have over 20 of them, but I also realized it kind of divides evenly between books that I read this year in the last 7.5 months, books that I read last year, which is full year, and then books that I read between about 2018 and 2024. And then there's a couple from before then, but getting that far back, either I'm less confident I had that reaction, or the impact they've had on me, I've assimilated it so much, I'm not sure how much of it still is affecting me and how much of it is I've gotten past it. So I figure I'm going to do 3 videos on this, assuming this one does okay and doesn't tank in the algorithm, starting with this year, the books that I read which immediately became like instant favorites. And of course, there could be recency bias here, right, in terms of I'm remembering more recent stuff. And I think there's some of that, but I also think as I've been doing this channel, which I started seriously thinking about doing at the start of last year and then really began working on the start of this year, I've gotten better at figuring out how to pick books. And so I think legitimately a lot of these are going to remain in my all-time favorite books that I liked immediately a decade or 2 down the line. So assuming this video does okay, I'll do the same thing for last year and then slightly more recent books. But I wanted to start with the one fiction book on the list from this year, which is Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky, which this is already one of my all-time favorite science fiction novels. I would say this whole series is the best depiction of biological uplift. People, of course, think of Bryn because he named it, but he didn't originate it. That was actually H.G. Wells and the Island of Dr. Moreau, and there are other people who've done uplift. I'm going to do a whole video on it, but the uplift, the way he handles it is wonderful, but also the way he writes this novel, it's like perfect, but perfect in a way that I've often said there's a difference between books that are flawless and books that are great, because books that are flawless, they might sort of seem perfect and they're forgettable. This book has given me a lot to think about, as have, to a lesser extent, some of the later books in the series, and again, I'll talk more about it. And then next on my list is this book, How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read by Pierre Bayard, which I made a video about that didn't itself perform badly, but performed so badly relatively that the algorithm punished me for the next several videos, which is not supposed to happen, but it did. And there were 2 things in that video. One is I screwed up the audio, but also I made the deliberate decision from reading, I think it was a different book, people liking the idea of Proustianism, where you go on digressions, which is my natural way of speaking. So I decided to lean into that, and a lot of people complained about that. And so I'm not sure how much was the audio, how much was the length combined with the Proustian digressions, but not trying that again anytime soon. But I am going to talk more about this book because basically, so Pierre Bayard is a French guy, and he's using these 12 books, some of which are not books, they're other media works, to talk about how we relate to reading and these ideas of how we relate to reading. The single most exciting thing from this to me is that he introduces this idea of 3 libraries of the mind, which relate to the socially objective, the subjective, and the intersubjective, and I'll probably make a short on that. I already did a short on the collective library, which is our conception or the social reality of how these books relate to each other in space, but I'm going to want to talk about it more. But the thing about this book is it was itself just, for me, an absolute joy to read. And there was another book written a year after by an English guy who thought it was too French, too abstract, and he hated it and he tried to be more concrete, which was okay, but definitely not one of my favorites. This one is like perfect, and I loved it. And I'm starting with this one in the nonfiction because it is sort of the most conceptual. I'm going to work down from more conceptual books to more concrete books, roughly. And so the next book that I read this year that immediately became one of my all-time favorites is The Logic of Liberty by Michael Polanyi. And I'm going to note, this is a collection of essays, and I was sort of debating, do I include like essay collections? And I decided only if there's really a consistent through line. And This one is borderline, but it has impacted me so much, and it immediately became one of my favorites, that I think it's worth including. It has mostly been really three things from this book that have impacted my thinking, and I've talked about in other videos. And the first of them is he has this idea of polycentric problems and the limits to computing them at about 150, which overlaps with Dunbar's number, like the main Dunbar's number, and I've written a blog post on. And then you also have, he draws a distinction between sort of what Thomas Kuhn would call revolutionary science versus ordinary science, not in those terms. And that was what eventually got me to finally read Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And then finally, there was the realization that academia actually used to be like people believe it is. And I would have been a good fit for academia in the 40s and 50s, but then it's become increasingly bureaucratized, which is what I've always known it as and why I never seriously, as an adult, considered trying to go into it. And so those were three useful realizations for me. Oh, and actually, I realized I forgot to mention, and I made a video correcting myself, because I want to call it the fiduciary principle. It's something else, but Michael Polanyi has two concepts related to fiduciary something or other, and one of them is basically the assumption that you need to believe in something to have sort of an operating worldview, which is similar to what William James has talked about in Pragmatism. If everyone has a philosophy that we operate on, and it's helpful to be aware of what your philosophy is. And that was helpful too, as well as he introduces in here, he has another book, The Tacit Dimension, talking about it more explicitly, but he does sort of get to some of these ideas about a lot of our knowledge of any living tradition, including science, is intuitive and implicit and cannot be explicitly taught except by practice learning from other people within the living tradition, which is something I already believed, I already knew was important, but seeing him talking about it in terms of science and explaining that really the scientific method as we understand it has only developed once, and then it has spread only by bringing in people who were trained in it to sort of seed that new culture, and it's potentially easy to kill off and very hard to rebuild. That was an interesting point as well. So I guess there's actually at least 5 things I got from this, possibly more. But yeah, this has been a hugely impactful book for me. And then next up, we have After Virtue by Alistair MacIntyre, which is interesting because I did a poll with 4 philosophy books that I read the introduction in first chapter, or in 1 or 2 cases, they didn't have an introduction, so the first 2 chapters, to get a sense of the book. And then I read one of them, and it was like I couldn't put it down like in a day. And I wanted people to see what it was, and that was The Mirror of Nature by Richard Rorty. But everyone, like the easy winner of the poll was this book. And I read it, and I don't know how many of the people who voted for it know what's in this book, but I see why. Because basically his thesis is that for most of human history, we've had a conception of virtue as being a practice, and like it's doing well within this sort of embodied practice. And the specifics have differed a lot, but it was only deep into the Enlightenment that we decided virtue should be utilitarianism, which I think he calls thin relations or thin ethics, which is, it just doesn't work on a number of accounts. And I've been a critic of utilitarianism my whole adult life, while also sort of not being able to articulate why there's a problem in terms of what I'd learned. I had to sort of step outside the framework that I learned to articulate my problems with it. And this book, I think, also, at least the way he's presenting his take, explains why I dislike Stoicism a little bit. Because Stoicism, he basically says, is sort of a halfway point between the thin virtue of utilitarianism and the traditional virtue of a practice. And in Nassim Nicholas Taleb's terms, it would be utilitarianism is fragile, traditional practices are anti-fragile, and Stoicism is resilient. And people have described me as resilient being one of my best qualities, but when I read Taleb, I realized I spent my life trying to be anti-fragile, and so Stoicism's approach to things as, okay, well, life is pain and suffering, just sort of suck it up and get better at it. It's like, no, you sometimes have to get through unpleasant things, but you should learn from it and try to avoid it as much as you can without obstructing other aspects of your life. And then next up, we have The Windmills of Sancho Panza, which I wonder if I had read this before Revolt of the Masses, if I would have found it less of a joy. By the time I read this, I was already sort of accepting that the way that I had understood egalitarianism was untenable. I cannot believe anymore that equality of opportunity, like in any meaningful way, is possible. Indeed, it's easier to achieve equality of outcomes, because if you do a nuclear winter and everyone is gone, I mean, you can't achieve equality of outcomes either if you have people like alive and living their lives, but it's probably still easier to get closer to than meaningful equality of opportunity. And I can no longer believe that people are nearly as substantially similar in their capabilities and motivations as I once believed. And I'm going to have a video on this at some point, but if I'm coming across as a lot more elitist in my videos, I'm going to make a video on that because being called an elitist no longer bothers me for a number of reasons. But anyways, so Friedrich Hayek was the one who sort of opened that question and made me really question it. Revolt of the Masses dealt the death blow to it. And the Windmills of Sancho Panza, it's addressing kind of the same topics of the impossibility of equality, but the prose is beautiful. And when I read it, I'm like, okay, this is sort of coming to terms with, you can still have, equality of human worth without needing a lot of the assumptions we've made about it. And so, again, Windmills of Sancho Panza by Tage, Ortega, Lindbohm is also one of these books that I immediately loved and it became a favorite. And the next one is it was borderline for me because both the author and the context in which this book was written, I really should not like this book as much as I did, but that is Land and Sea by Carl Schmitt. And I haven't talked about this one at all. I haven't mentioned it yet. And that's because the author's career history was problematic. And when he wrote this book, this was him basically telling the German leadership in the Second World War, you shouldn't be invading Russia. Our real enemies are the British because they are like a deracinated, rootless people. And the translator keeps noting like all the things that he sees as anti-Semitic in here as well, which does not seem to me like, even though he has a reputation of being anti-Semitic and he was a defender of the World War II German regime, it seems like he is much more obsessed with seeing the British as his enemies. And it's on account of the deracination that you have in maritime cultures, which I think is a really interesting topic. And of course, I would not go nearly as far as he did in a lot of this, but again, the prose was beautiful. And so I was like, do I include this or not? It's on the fence. And I think, honestly, the fact that it is kind of a problematic book is part of what makes it so fascinating to me, because written by a problematic person at a problematic time, but the prose is beautiful and he's getting to something. I read this right around the time, I think maybe a little after, I did my video on why Imagine is coming true and it sucks. And I realized he's covering a lot of these same ideas here. And then sort of on that note, and this is part of the reason I ended up including Schmitt's book, is this book, Shadow Empires by Thomas Barfield, which I talked about in at least 2 videos, one of them sort of focusing on it a bit more. But basically he's talking about, so all endogenous empires, traditional empires, are empires in the same way, but then you have what he calls exogenous empires or shadow empires, and they have a bunch of different forms. And his research was on steppe empires, and then you have the reflective steppe empires that are mirrors to the state societies. And then you have the ones that conquer states themselves, and they either become endogenous empires or they collapse when the culture recovers. And then you have, of course, the sea peoples, the maritime peoples, which again is why I was willing to have Land and Sea on this list, even though because I genuinely like it, even though there are problems with this book, or I guess problems more with the author of the book, I suppose I should say. And then you have things, for example, empires of nostalgia, so the Holy Roman Empire. You have the Vulture and Vanquisher empires, which the Vulture empires are the steppe empires conquering people. The Vanquisher empires are conquering empires at their peak, and it's only happened with Persia. And then the one that really captures my imagination is what he calls the jellyfish empires of the forest zones. And this is all passing. I've talked about it already, but this goes with The Art of Not Being Governed by James C. Scott as one of my favorite, I don't know if you call it political science anthropology books, but these are the books, that's what I made a video about, is I want to see people world building, using books like this and factoring it in, because they describe these interesting political dynamics that most world builders in fantasy science fiction worlds don't consciously consider, that I think could dramatically improve that writing. And then finally, we have Doughnut Economics by Kate Raworth, which I talked about in my social sciences video, and I did a short about it, and I might have talked about it a couple other times. And as I said, when I first saw this, because I discovered her YouTube channel, I thought of it as a YouTuber book, but she is actually a professional development economist. And when reading it, as I said, initially it gave me whiplash, because the best books are ones that I partially agree with and I have a frame of reference, and partially disagree with and I have to think about why. Or at least, there are also ones where I think all of these, like I don't disagree with Shadow Empires, right? But it still made me think, right? So I have a frame of reference I agree with, and then it makes me think in some ways. Most of these other books that I showed, I had at least some disagreement, but I had to think about why. And then there is so much new information, and she is someone like Kate Raworth, I am convinced, is someone who I describe my thinking as being upside down and outside in compared to most people. And I think she is someone like this. And I probably going to reread parts of this book sooner just because it is so information dense. But the fundamental consequence of this book, as I said, if I had made my video on books that overturn my worldview, this one would have made it on it. Because after reading Fatal Conceit by F.A. Hayek and Revolt of the Masses by Jose Ortega y Gasset, I sort of fundamentally gave up on my ability to believe in individualism and egalitarianism as I had believed in them. But of course, I come from a culture which is very individualistic and egalitarian, not just a Western culture in general, but New England specifically, which both sort of individualism and egalitarianism are a big part of our culture, and it is ingrained in me. And so my instinct is to make the minimal concessions to this new realization necessary to continue operating in the world without cognitive dissonance, basically, and I know that's how I operate. But this is the first book that I read that really offers sort of productive ideas about how you might move forward without either a commitment to strict individualism or to strict egalitarianism. And she doesn't assume either of those, but she still sort of talks about things from the same angles that a lot of people who focus on those things do, or not same angles. It's hard to describe. I'm still processing it, but again, this book was a joy to read, and I think I mentioned reading this book has made me think I want to possibly think about trying to do interviews on my channel now, because I want to interview her, and I'm thinking about other people I might interview as well. But anyways, so wanted to talk about these books quickly. Thanks for watching. I'm Magpie. Oh, and the book club. So I'm going to have the Discord server in the poll. I don't know if I'll have figured out, I've made it, but I haven't figured out how to lock it down and unlock it easily, so I may have it completely locked down, and I'll figure that out by the time that it happens. But the book club for Max Weber's Protestant Ethic and Spirit of Capitalism is Saturday, August 29th at 2 p.m. Central Time. And if you haven't read it and you're wondering, the Penguin Classics version, which is the first edition, is about 90 pages of actual stuff, and then a lot of the rest is footnotes. The public domain version I linked, I think, is probably second edition. I don't know how long that is. I might see if I can find a public domain first edition, but I don't know if I'll do that in time for this video. I will announce it in a community post if I haven't done it in time for this video. But anyways, if you're interested in the book club, I will have the link to the server, which might be completely locked down below. Again, I'm Magpie. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next one.